as you can see, I am an associate professor and chair of humanities at Merrimack College. I'm a women's historian, and I'm a post-World War II or 20th century women's historian. So today I was asked to talk to you about working women in World War II and beyond. And part one of this conversation is going to be mostly about women in the workplace, and part two is going to be about what happened after the war when women are being pushed from jobs and pushed maybe into or drawn into opening businesses of their own, which is my area of expertise. So if you know a little something about women in World War II, then you know that when the men went off to war, women were recruited to pick up those jobs that men had held to keep the war effort going in the United States. And these are just a couple of examples of the kinds of posters that people saw produced by the US government, various government agencies, state government agencies, all designed to recruit women to enter jobs that may have been seen as traditionally male before the war. People tend to think about World War II in ways that I kind of want to interrupt a little bit today. And the way that people typically think about it is that women were drawn to the workforce, held those jobs that soldiers that men had before they left for war, then got pushed out of the workforce, went home and had babies, and hence we get the baby boom. It's not exactly accurate. There were about 11 million women in the workforce before World War II. One of every 2 women in the workforce was there because they had dependents at home. Their income was necessary. And that's a piece that gets missing out of this story. But what World War II does, as I'm going to show you a little bit today, is that it interrupts and rewrites a conversation about what women's roles should really be. And it interrupts that conversation that says women's place is only in the home, and that they're not capable of doing things that men have traditionally done. And after that, it creates a sort of tension for what do we do in the post-war era now that we've started to see women can do things that men did too. So to just kind of walk back to this for a second, women got a ton of messages. And one of the messages that they got, aside from what you're seeing here about being a really good patriot, right? A good patriotic citizen will come and enter the workforce, take those jobs. The other message they got was that they would learn skills that would enable them to get the kinds of jobs they couldn't get before the war. They could become welders, they could become machinists, they could work in manufacturing, they could make a man's wage. And if they came and learned the skills by taking these wartime jobs. The messages were pretty heavy. They got them from everywhere. I'm showing you here in this slide that Katharine Hepburn was recruited to be in a war sort of mini, kind of like a newsreel that Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to encourage women to take wartime jobs. Posters were everywhere, and you can see in this particular one what I said before, that we need you, and you can do all kinds of jobs, including the ones listed here. Many of the women who signed up were not only good patriotic women, they were also women who wanted to get skilled jobs. The gender pay gap, as we talk about it today, in the pre-war era was something like 50 cents on the dollar for women, for white women, and more like 30 cents on the dollar for black women. So for every dollar a man earned in pre-World War II, women earned about 50 cents if they were white, 30 cents if they were a person of color. What I wanted to share with you, and I'm going to apologize in the beginning, is one of the newsreels that people saw in movie theaters. If you went to a movie theater during the war era, you saw, instead of the previews that we see today, you saw newsreels from the government, a lot of them propaganda, but not all. Some of them designed to recruit people, some of them designed to tell you what was going on with the war. And in this particular one I'm going to show you, it was designed to recruit women to enter the war. Factory jobs and all of that. There are 2 apologies here. The first one is that we have to get through some YouTube commercials first. David and I tried very hard to move us past them. It just won't let us. The second is that it will quickly and abruptly end. But bear with me for about 3 minutes here as we watch this really cool piece of history.
Your recital.
The commercials.
Now lavender with ribbon trim.
peach with puffed sleeves. Pearls.
The Hidden Army drew fresh recruits. Its ranks grew to nearly 18 million. Many of these women came from walks of life not previously considered. The mothers, the young, the aged. When they were asked why they had joined the ranks of the Hidden Army, these women gave a variety of reasons.
I have a daughter in the waves, and I had a son on the Arizona. That's a good enough reason for anyone.
I'm an old maid, and I didn't have anyone until I took this defense job. Now, I have a family of 10 million to look after. I send them cases of these every week to help them to get home soon.
I go to college, but I arrange my classes so that I can help out in the war effort. This way I'll get my diploma and war bonds.
I was too heavy for the life, so I joined up in defense work. Yesterday was the big day of my life. The foreman told me I was worth my weight in gold. My husband's a prisoner of the Jets in the Philippines. If he'd had a few more of these shells out in the pan, maybe he'd still be fighting. Whenever I get a bit tired, I think of him on that death march.
The special needs of women workers were more widely recognized in many vital defense areas. For mothers, child care nurseries. For housekeepers, stores and markets were persuaded to stay open evenings. Hairdressers, dances, movies, sports were more and more made available at the unaccustomed hours required by the Hidden Army. Indeed, in some plants, much of the routine of contemporary living was made easier for the woman war worker than for her stay-at-home sister, because it was concentrated under the one roof. There was no longer the necessity to traipse all over town for her dental appointment, her driver's license, her ration coupons. They were all within a few yards of the assembly line. More and more, the special needs of women workers were realized and met. Oh yes, there was another girl we canvassed for her reason for entering war work.
Why did I take the defense job? That's a funny question. I never thought of that before. Do you happen to have a reason? We're in a jam, aren't we? I'm sorry, but you'll have to excuse me. I'm too busy to answer through questions like that.
Somehow that answer pleased us. No sudden emotional urge sent this young woman into war work. No loss of a loved one. No temporary economic embarrassment. No mere yearning for excitement or novelty. Democracy is in a jam. There are millions like her. There will have to be. 18 million women aren't enough. As more men are called for military service, their places must be taken by women. We are forced to face casualties at the front. But never again, as during 1943, can one woman quit for every two who are hired. There's no time to be spent in the constant training of new replacements. Without the help of additional thousands of women, we cannot build the mountains of material consumed in global invasion. We cannot make good the millions of man-hours and woman-hours that are lost in a fleeting second's smoke and flame. That is why the women of America, like the men at their side, must flock to war jobs and stick to their jobs until that day when an end has...
I told you it ended abruptly.
The NHL doesn't just hand out silver.
Okay. So you notice that they talked about the fact that in 1943, 2 women left for every 1 woman who was hired. There was this period of intense recruitment, and when things seemed to be going well, and because women were juggling home and jobs, and many of them had no help at home for things like babysitting or cooking the meals or whatever, some women would leave the workforce pretty quickly. And so they're talking about, like, we can't have that again. They're really recruiting these women. So I'm going to talk about Rosie the Riveter in a minute, but this is the sheet music to the Rosie the Riveter song, and the lyrics are right next to it. And again, it's another very popular song from 1943, all designed to praise women who became those welders, those riveters on war machines and ships and planes. And if you notice in some of the lyrics, it talks about that She's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. I'm going to play a little bit of it for you, but I have to warn you, when I play this for my students, they never forgive me because it becomes the earworm they cannot get out of their head for days. So you've been warned. You can decide if you want to hurt me afterwards also. Here we go.
The way you see an idea.
Okay, I didn't think it was going to do this.
And shape it into something that could only.
Did I do the wrong thing?
Come from you. This is how website creation should be. Wix Harmony.
Okay, there we go. I didn't do that before.
All the day long, but the rain or shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the riveter, keeps a sharp lookout for sabotage, sitting up there on the fuselage.
Let me know when you've had it.
Do more than the women do. Rosie, the riveter, Rosie's got our friend Charlie. Charlie, he's a Marine. Rosie is protecting Charlie, working overtime on the riveting machine. When they gave her a production need, she was as proud as a girl could be. There's something true about red, white, and blue about Rosie, the riveter.
Okay, you see why my students get really mad at me, right? That song gets into your head and you can't get it out of your head. Now I'll be singing it for the next 2 days as well. But just imagine if you're a woman in the 1940s of a certain age who is being recruited for these jobs, seeing all these very heavy-handed but positive messages about what it means to contribute to the war effort. It becomes very hard not to be a part of it. And as you can see from these images, these are women contributing in a variety of ways in traditionally male jobs. So I'm going to ask you a question and see if anybody has the answer. My question is, why do you think that unions were fighting for women to be paid the same wages as men during the war years? Because up until then, no. And up until then, by the way, women were told they could never do these jobs because it would require extensive training. Of course, during the war, they got trained in 6 days, 6 weeks. But now the unions are, instead of saying no women, are saying, oh no, yes women, and you must pay them the same as men. Any
To stem the flow of the women who are leaving the workforce.
to keep them employed?
Yeah.
Maybe. Other guesses? There's one real reason.
To grow the consumer base.
No, but that happens after the war. No, the real reason is they didn't want women to depress men's wages when they came back from war. So if they could pay women less for the jobs men did, when the men came back, they were fearful that men's wages would go down because they were able to get the job done more cheaply by hiring women. So they were not benevolent union members, and I do love my unions, but they were not benevolent union members. They were actually engaged in self-preservation for men's wages, as women are doing all of these things. And just as a side note, women are also, by the way, being sort of faced with all kinds of concerns about loss of femininity, traditional job roles, whether they entered the military, which hundreds of thousands of them did, or whether they were working with men. It becomes very important that they were still every bit women. So if you'll notice this in some of the other images in a minute, but the clip I showed you earlier talked about daycare centers. Those clips overrepresented the presence of child care centers for women. There were some, but again, in the context of the 1940s, people were reticent to leave their children with strangers. This is a new thing. And they were more likely to leave children with relatives, first of all. There are some women whose stories that I've seen and read about who left their children for years during the war so that they could move, say, from one part of the country to the other to work in the war plants, rather than do this, if there even was a child care center. Now, this one is at Kaiser, and you can see it's set up almost in this sort of pentagon shape. In the middle is a wading pool. Those are all the different buildings. And there was all kinds of areas for children to play. It looked very much like a kindergarten might today. But the minute the war ended, they were closed. So again, there's this World War II moment that could have been a moment for a long-term change that wasn't. And these were few and far between. They were not available to every woman who worked. They were probably only affected about 20% of the women who worked. So for everybody else, it was kind of catch as catch can for childcare. So you heard the Rosie song. This is probably the image most of you have seen of Rosie the Riveter? Yes? Yes. So, okay. Most people in America did not see this image in 1940s. This was actually a Westinghouse Company internal brochure. It was meant for employees to keep the morale up because they were short on war supplies. So, if you're working on a job and you're not getting all the material you need to complete your job and it's affecting your morale, your frustration, they created this brochure, this image of Rosie the Riveter, to say, we can do it, we just have to keep going, we have to support the war, we can get through it. The reason we've all seen it, side note here, is that women's historians in the 1980s resurrected it, and it became popular ever since. But people in the 40s, unless you worked at Westinghouse, you probably didn't see this image. And even so, women have argued and fought to say, I was, in fact, the woman who posed for that. This is Naomi Parker Fraley, who in 2022 was the person that a historian said, yes, I think it was her. After 22, there were others. I'm going to tell you the real answer. It is that there were lots of women who posed for Rosie the Riveter materials, which is why none of them are wrong. They are all correct. But the image of Rosie that most people saw was this one. And this one is Norman Rockwell's. It was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, which most homes got, right? Most middle-class homes for sure. It was a very popular magazine in that time period. And if you notice, this Rosie is very different than the other Rosie. Not only is it based on the Michelangelo Isaiah portrait, which is why I have them both side by side, but this is not the most feminine Rosie, right? And I don't know if you can see it, but if it comes through clearly, but there's so many different moments you can pick on here to really sort of think about what Norman Rockwell was trying to say about these women who were being called into war work. My favorite, there's two, but my favorite is that she's got her foot on a very particular book. Can you tell what it is? It's Mein Kampf. So she's crushing Hitler, right? And I think in the original, you probably could have made it out more clearly than you can seeing it up on the screen. What was the date on this? 1943. 43? Yeah. My other, it says May 29th, 1943. I think it says 9. My other favorite, of course, is that everything she's doing with a sandwich in her hand, which I just think is hysterical, right? Because, she's got physical strength. She's got muscles, real muscles. Like, I'm sorry, I don't want to meet her in an alley. She wins. I walk away. No hands down, and I'm pretty scrappy. So she's meant to be both strong, tough, but there's no question she's a woman. And if you had any doubts, she's wearing lipstick. And she's got some mascara on, right? So there's just those nods to femininity here, even while saying our women are strong, they're tough, they will help us crush Hitler. This was the Rosie everybody saw. This one, and of course the sheet music that I showed you earlier, were the far more popular versions of Rosie. Now, the United States, in spite of this effort to recruit women, has still got racial hiring laws in place, vast racial discrimination, that white men refused to hire both black men and women, that in 1941, when Mary McLeod Bethune and African-American activist A. Philip Randolph informed Roosevelt that people were being discriminated against, he passed Executive Order 8802 that banned racial discrimination in the defense industry. Notice it's not in every industry. And that after that, black women's defense employment increased. And as you can see, 600,000 of the 1 million African Americans who were hired by the defense industry after that were women, so more than half. So when you think of Rosie the Riveter, it's important to think that Rosie had African American counterparts. that also worked as sheet metal workers in munitions factories on explosives. They often, though, got the lower paid jobs, the more dangerous jobs, like I said, working with explosives, where white women may have been doing more of the riveting in safer spaces. But they were there too, 100%. And again, here you go. They also were barred from union activities and received fewer benefits and lower wages, but still did pretty well. So by the end of the war, women are doing pretty well. And you can see from this article that I took from, I believe, 1947, 48, that the average wages for women rose 60% in these industries that they had previously been unable to work in. But if you notice way down low, where it compares women's wages to men's, we're still just slightly above 50%. So you see that women are earning $22 a week versus men earning $42, and that was in 1942. Later, women are earning $38, men are earning $59. So it's not quite half anymore. It's probably more like 60%, 60 cents on the dollar. But still, you're seeing this increase in women's wages. When the war ended, by the time the war ended, a couple of things had changed, and changed permanently. The composition of working women in the workforce went from being primarily single women to primarily married women. Middle-class women were working in ways they had not before the war. Poor women have always worked, right? So that's not a surprise to anybody. Poor women had always worked, and the poor women who wanted to work in the war years probably fared really well by the jobs that were available to them and the wages available. So the shift in the composition of women working, the percentage of women working, it was about 38% of women were now in the workforce, and 80% of those women who worked during the war wanted to keep their jobs. So that myth of everybody wants to leave, everybody's going to go back and have babies, is a myth. That most women, for many reasons, one, the money. Remember that before World War II, America was in a very long depression. People were very afraid that we might go back to another depression. The war ended it, but what happens when the war production stops? Now, we all know what happened, right? Because we can stand back here and say, well, they converted the factories to consumer goods. That's true. And when they converted the factories to consumer goods, they needed people to buy them. People need money to buy the consumer goods. The beginnings of the two-income family is born right here. It's not born in the 60s like a lot of people who don't like the women's movement want to say all the time. It's born right here in the post-war era, with fears about another recession, with fears about beating the communists, which meant creating the best free enterprise system in the world, and that meant consumer products and people buying them, as somebody said earlier. That became very, very important. But the question remains, all these servicemen are coming back. They're going to want their jobs back. How do we push women from jobs? At the same time, we want women to still think of themselves as economic beings for the free enterprise system, but also because many leaders did not think that World War II was the end. They really believed there would be another global conflict, and they did not want to be caught without a ready labor market. So how do we keep women thinking about themselves in all these ways while still getting them out of jobs? And the third sort of important piece of the story is that the large number of casualties from World War II meant that either men didn't come back at all, or they came back too injured to work, which meant women were going to be primary breadwinners in brand new ways. So this is where my story begins. For me, this is where the story begins. Just to give you a sense of how we get from World War II to today, I got a few fun facts for you. That today women open 1,817 businesses every day across the United States. That women own 42% of all US businesses. That women's ventures fail at the same rate as men's. I put that there because the first time I gave a talk, somebody asked me that question. It was their very first question. I thought, not going to ask me that ever again. Most women start businesses with credit cards or savings. And that women of color are actually the fastest growing category of new women entrepreneurs today. But all of these trends begin in the post-war era, which is why I'm bringing you up to the present before I take you back to the past. The book that I wrote basically looks at this moment in World War II as the starting place, and that the effort to move women out of those jobs was not quite as accepted by the women themselves or by the leaders who thought about a future. That for many of those leaders, seeking to replace the small businesses lost during the war, seeking to stabilize the US economy, and seeking to ensure a ready labor market, looked to women's business ownership as the solution to all their problems. So I like to say to people, women didn't just go home after the war, they went home to start a business. And that's true for many of them. The book takes that even further. It goes through the 1950s and 60s and 70s all the way pretty close to the present. I like to say pretty close because historians don't like to actually predict what the present is going to mean. And to be honest with you, if I had to predict the future, the ending of my book today, when it was published, would be very different than the ending of my book today, just given the change in power in our nation right now and some of the ways in which that has affected women entrepreneurs. So the things I was pointing to at the end of my book, which was printed in 2025 but was finished in 2024, I might point to a few other places. But as the war was winding down, lots of business leaders and politicians and government officials were meeting to discuss what a post-war world would look like and what women's place in it might be. They had all these really cool utopian ideas, some of which actually I wish they had taken hold. For example, some of them thought men would work 30 hours a week and women would work 30 hours a week and both would share childcare responsibilities. Wouldn't that have been lovely? Never happened. But they really were imagining a different possibility for America in the 44, 45, and meeting constantly. This is just one of the many documents from what they met and talked about. And if you look over here on that side, you can see the ways they're talking about women won't go back, things have changed, they've learned new things. They're quite concerned about how you can't really turn a clock back, so how do you channel the energy created by the war? This is another one of those documents. It's the National Association of Manufacturers. I mean, we're talking about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, government leaders, business leaders, all getting together, trying to solve this problem, recognizing, if you notice in the top, how much of America's investment money women control. And it's a lot. And in this same document, giving the story of a woman who started a business. The story of Casey, what is it? I can't see it from here. Casey Mary Smith Baker, right, who starts a business and she talks about how she gets it off the ground. But the real, and I'll say one last thing about that. And also in 1945, you get Mildred Pierce, and if you haven't seen this movie, you really, really should, or the HBO remake series of it. What I always like to talk about Mildred Pierce because this is the movie Joan Crawford won the Oscar for in 1945, and she plays a woman entrepreneur. And no one cared. So if you read all of the movie reviews, film critics disliked this character, and she was really dislikable. I mean, she spoiled her child. She was a very indulgent suburban mother, and the film critics actually talk about that. When they talk about the film, that this was a film that, doesn't address terrible mothering. But what they don't talk about, what they take for granted, is that she's a successful business owner, and she provides for her family after separation/divorce by first selling pies and cakes that eventually become a series of restaurants. There was no discomfort by the media with that at all. And to me, that's a milestone kind of moment. The big change, though, comes in 1945 when my friend Jane Todd here, not really my friend, but when Jane Todd gets appointed as the first woman commerce commissioner in the state of New York. Jane Todd was involved in the suffrage movement. Jane Todd was a Republican politico who helped Governor Dewey get elected, and organized women voters to help him get elected. When he got elected, he knew he owed women something. He gave a lot of articles thanking his mother, his wife, and Jane Todd. Todd takes this, and I think he thinks, oh, put her in the Commerce Department, make her a deputy, keep the women happy. I think that's what he thought. But I don't think he understood fully how formidable Jane Todd was. Jane Todd took this opportunity and ran with it. She did two things. Yes, she looked at job programs for women, but what she really did was she took her position and created a women's program designed to help women start businesses. And then she took that initiative to the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs to help mainstream that across the country. Because of what Jane Todd did in New York and with the BPW, 9 other states opened women's programs across the country to help women start businesses, including Massachusetts. What she did was revolutionary. She then created a women's council, which included famous women, well-known women at the time who had been successful entrepreneurs, such as Elizabeth Arden, and ran these things called small business clinics, places where if you had an idea, you could come, bring your idea, show it to Elizabeth Arden, to bankers, to whomever, get advice on how to write a business proposal, how to sell this, how to market it. Lots and lots of women got their start through these programs. At one point, Jane Todd's office gets 750 calls a day from all over the country for their brochure on how to start a business. And you can see in this slide next to it, next to her picture, a sample of what these clinics look like. So in the post-war era, if you think about this, during the war, you can't get mayonnaise, you can't get salad dressing, you can't get a lot of foods made with oils because a lot of those things were rationed or in low supply. The US government, for example, at the end of the war, starts publishing pamphlets on how to make a business of salad dressings and mayonnaises. And when I tell people about this, they chuckle just like my friend Karen just did, because they're like, oh, women are going to start businesses making salad dressings and mayonnaises. Yes, because they were in short supply during the war. And people wanted tasty food again. They wanted those things. There was one woman, Dorothy Chase, who started a business selling pickled herring, and she made a killing. She went from selling it door to door in local supermarkets to becoming one of Jane Todd's case studies. Her business got up, by 1948, it got up to $250,000 a year. I can't translate it in my head right now, but it was close to over $1 million business by today's standards. She started that business because she had a husband who came back from the war injured. She had to support her family. But what women did was they commercialized the domestic. They took all the things they did for their families for free and figured out how to make a business out of it. And Todd and her representatives across the country helped them do that in really, really large numbers. The other thing about Todd, she wanted women to take themselves seriously. She said this is not a small thing that you're just going to sell to your neighbors. This is serious business. So this is an example of one of the exhibits at her small business clinics. They ran these clinics everywhere. The ones in Iowa got 450 women at them driving from all across farm country just to get there to learn how to start a business. I mean, this tells you something, right? That if people are driving far, far away, setting these things up all around the country, there's a demand, there's a hunger there. You can see here from this picture, this is both the floor of the clinic in New York, but it's also, just looking at this image, how many people are there in attendance and, like women did in the 40s, dressed beautifully, to hear speakers give them any kind of advice at all. Todd didn't limit it to city women. She also is talking to farm women. Here she's saying you can have a roadside stand if that's the kind of business that you want to have. The other thing about Todd is she wanted women to take themselves seriously. So when women did anything with money, it was called pin money. My dissertation that the book was based on was called Beyond Pin Money. And it was called that because Pin money refers to two things. It refers to money that women were kind of secreting away from the family budget to either buy themselves little baubles, pins, or that money that women pin to the inside of their bras to protect themselves, to have their own money for a rainy day. But it was never seen as the needed money for the household. So the minute you called something that women did pin money, you were automatically saying it's part-time, it's less than, it's not serious. Todd hated that. And so what Todd called these things, and yet Todd has to kind of walk this line between not upsetting the apple cart about women as mothers and traditional family roles, but at the same time trying to get women to see that they could do anything and be anything that they wanted to be. So she calls what women do sidelines. That's as far as she's willing to go. She won't call it pin money, but she goes, these are just two articles with her saying, look, it's not pin money, it's serious money. She goes to Harlem to recruit women of color to start businesses. She promises the state that women will help restore the 100,000 businesses lost during the war. And everywhere she goes, you see it's more than pin money. And by this article came out in 1948. Within 3 years of her program, she's claiming we've got nearly 1 million businesses, which is double what existed at the end of the war in New York State. So she's proving that this actually happened. And of course, everywhere you go now in this time period, you're going to see little articles about the kinds of businesses women are opening. A lot of them look like this, very sort of women in traditionally domestic work, but making it for a commercial marketplace. So this woman is delivering hot basket dinners to people. So yes, that's pretty much what Todd is doing. She runs those programs into the 1950s and 60s. By the 1950s, because of the sort of rising Cold War and really sort of shift toward motherhood and family and suburban life, what's happening there is that people start talking much more about women's entrepreneurship as what women do as good mothers, not what women do because they have talents and skills, but really keeping it in the context of women's work within the family. So when you see all these things together, you see a really different picture of World War II. Not only are women already in the workforce before they start recruiting them, but they want another 6 million, which they get, but also women seeing themselves as being capable of doing much more when the war ends, and not really accepting the plight of being kicked out of really good paying jobs to go back to doing the things women traditionally did, you know, small retail, beauty shops, etc., that didn't pay as well as those wartime jobs. So instead, many, many women say, fine, kick me out, I'm gonna start my own. And they do. So I'm gonna stop there and open up for questions if you all have anything, or comments or thoughts. Thank you.
Real quick.
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
We have this thing, which is for the benefit of people watching in the future and not so much people watching right now. So if you wouldn't mind asking your questions into the microphone.
Sure. When we go back to the plants, when they were working so diligently, were there more injuries and deaths to women at an average than there had been to men, or was it pretty much the same, or were the women more careful?
They had different issues with women. So there's a very, I call it funny, it probably wasn't funny at the time, there's a video that they sent out to supervisors, to women in the war plants, called Supervising Women. If you Google it, you can watch it. I say it's funny because the way they talk about women is just comical. They don't really understand us at all. But they do have concerns with things like women not wanting to pull their hair up, right? And I can relate to this because I never pull my hair up. So if you're working on a machine and you've got your head down, right, and your hair gets caught, there were women those women had injuries men didn't have right? So if you were not willing to do those safety measures, and they spent a lot of time trying to explain, and in that very funny little clip I mentioned, they say you have to talk to women differently. You can't just say to them, pull your hair up. You have to say to them, I care about you. I don't want you to get, it's not true, by the way. But what they're not wrong about is that just telling me to pull my hair up is not going to make me want to pull my hair up. You have to tell me my hair could get caught in the equipment. I'm done. Hair goes up. Like, that's right. So there were those instances of women who were not familiar with that kind of machinery, not realizing the risk when you put your head down, your hair can get caught in things, or, that all of it mostly related to hair, believe it or not, the injuries, because there's also things that can catch fire. There's just a lot of things. Were there injuries? Yes. I can't say whether there were more or equal. I'm going to guess that there were probably more in the beginning, less over time, because people ramp up and train. But that was a real issue, because again, women are getting two messages: be feminine, but work just as hard and well as a man. Okay, so how am I going to do that? I'm going to do that with the makeup, the lipstick, the hair, but I'm in the work suit from the neck down that looks just like what the men are wearing. So how do I do that? And that was the tricky part, yeah. So it was risky in the beginning, for sure. The biggest issue women faced, honestly, was what we call the double shift today. Working all day, coming home and having to cook a meal. Even if their husbands weren't there, a lot of times they were cooking for uncles, brothers, cousins, who were all often living together. And it didn't matter that she's the only one in the family who worked all day. It mattered that she was the one of the age who should be cooking. So yeah, that was the biggest. I mean, I think many women complain. That's why many women quit early on, because they were, I can't do all of this. Yeah. So, other questions?
You said that before the war there were 11 million women in the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of jobs did they have pre-war?
So for professional women, the vast majority were teachers and nurses, some social workers. But for everybody else, which is the majority of workers, it would be in traditionally feminized professions. So it might be dishwasher, waitress, bookkeeper, secretary, and even further down, working in garment factory work, and so on. So, I mean, as I said, and those numbers, that 11 million, does not include agricultural workers, because the government wasn't all that interested in them at that time. So, where the vast majority of people of color were working.
Right.
So, yeah.
Interesting. So that, I'm guessing then that the kind of jobs that women have changed dramatically during the war.
Right.
Because they went into straight factory jobs, if you will.
They went into men's jobs, which meant they could be welders, they could be, machinists, all that stuff.
All those things.
Yeah.
After the war, you talked about women starting to become entrepreneurs. Did that start to accelerate at any point, like in the 60s or 70s, or where it sort of started to ramp up?
Yes. I feel like I planted you in the audience. I love that question so much. I didn't. But yes, so what you see is kind of a slow, steady growth in the 40s and the 50s, and really into about the middle 60s. And then you start to see a little bit of an escalation with civil rights-based businesses that both women and men open, and of course the women's movement. And there are lots of businesses that women's movement activists start: bookshops, publishing companies, record companies, galleries, healthcare centers. I mean, I could go on and on. And they give all women, even women who are not feminists, even women who are not in the women's movement, a new language of rights, economic rights. Like, I have a right to start a business, where you see the big ramp up. So a lot of women start to fight for the 1974 Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Because before that, if you wanted credit, and you needed a man's signature, including if the man was your brother, your son, or unemployed. And so my women, for example, who were trying to get bank loans, by the 70s are really angry that they need their husband's signature. One woman in particular says, I never understood the women's movement until now, but I'm opening my third business, and they want my husband, who not only is unemployed but has never had a business before, to sign my loan application. I get the women's movement now, she says, okay? And I think she's fairly typical, by the way, but I think a lot of women who weren't activists or didn't understand or weren't part of the women's movement started to appropriate the same language that was being spoken around the right to credit. I mean, if you applied for credit before that Credit Act and you were divorced, they thought you were too unstable because, you were so sad that you didn't have a man that you would never pay your loans back. Even though women, by the way, had a long, solid, good history of investments, of savings, and so forth, it didn't matter. Because, and I always say this, capitalism is not rational. We like to think that capitalism is rational, but if capitalism was rational, women would have more jobs than men, because you can pay us less. And that's true throughout history. So why don't we? We don't because gender bias is stronger than capitalism. And the same with racial bias, because people of color could have been the most employed because you could pay them even less than women. So, right? But so capitalism is not rational. It wants to have our system wants to have what it wants and then figure out the bargain basement, equivalents all around it. And so in the 70s, once you get the Equal Credit Act, once you get the women's movement starting to mainstream some of that language of equality for even people who weren't part of the movement, you see a big uptick in the late 70s and early 80s. It goes from something like 4.6% of all businesses are owned by women in mid-70s to nearly 30% in the mid-80s.
So this was civil rights for white people.
It's civil rights for, certainly for, I would say civil rights for women, for entrepreneurs, certainly whites, but I think also for anyone who wanted to start a business. And just as a side note, in the 60s, the government started its Black Capitalism Program, which was designed to use the economy. This is all in my book, by the way. It designed to use the economy as a way to solve the civil rights problems. It said, okay, if we really do have racial inequality, and we had all the Great Society programs in the 60s, which were designed to sort of eliminate inequality. But if money is power in a capitalist system, we just have to help people of color get some money. How do we do that? We'll give them loans and help them start businesses. Of course, the people administering the loans were all white men who didn't always understand the kinds of businesses people of color wanted to start. And they only really wanted to fund black men because they wanted to model black families on white families with a male breadwinner. So when women applied for those loans, they had to do what Grace Kelly did. That old saying, Grace Kelly had to do everything Fred Astaire did except backwards and in high heels. Well, black women had to do that, and backflips at the same time, because if they wanted any of that black capitalism money to start their businesses, and one famous example I have in my book is a woman who had to work 2 years for free in a hamburger restaurant to prove to the Small Business Administration that she was serious about the soul food kitchen she wanted to start. So yeah, we do see those surges, but it's only when laws start to change.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
2 questions for you, and maybe 3 questions. The first is, they talked about sabotage in the Rosie the Riveter song. And my first question would be, did these women face danger through either sabotage or through sexual advances or male-female disagreements?
So yes and yes. And that's one of the other things they keep addressing in training videos, like don't play favorites, which I think is code for sexual harassment, but they didn't have that language back then. That's a 70s, 80s word. So they would say things like don't play favorites, don't spend too much time talking to just one girl, keep the lines of business separate from the lines of your personal life. So I read that as there's definitely some stuff going on here. The other, what was the first part of your question? Sabotage. Oh, the sabotage. So sabotage, there's lots of studies on sabotage, and sabotage happens any time a group enters a field dominated by any other group. So we see it across racial lines and we see it across gender lines. And in the beginning, there absolutely was sabotage that women were facing at their workstations. It's a way of saying we don't want you here. So your workstation might be sabotaged as a way of saying you're taking a man's job, or we don't want any women doing this work. I think that was one of the things that supervisors were very mindful of, because women were not going to stay in jobs they were being sabotaged in, and they were going to tell their friends, right? Which means more and more women are not going to apply for those jobs. So they were very mindful of it. But yes, that song is definitely referencing like that problem.
So it wasn't sabotage by enemies of the state. It was sabotage.
Well, it's both. It's both. Yeah. I think the song is mostly talking about our enemies, but I think it's also a covert nod to people who are going to do that kind of sabotage to send a message to women. I think it's a covert nod to let's don't do that.
Especially if they're doing particularly well in that job. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, everything is upside down, right, in the 40s. It's really a cool period to study for that reason, that everything you thought you knew about America, if you were living in that time, is in flux. And it makes people very anxious. You can look anywhere throughout our history, and whenever there's change, which is pretty much every minute, people become heightened in their anxiety, right? We're living in an anxious period right now for very different reasons. But there are those moments where that anxiety peaks really high, and it's usually during wartime, for example, or times of other significant, say, technological innovation. So yeah, people's anxieties were running very high, and it felt like everything was in flux in scary ways. That's why I love that moment of saying 30 hours a week, we'll all work that and manage our families together. I thought, oh, wouldn't that have been lovely?
Well, that's the entree to my next question. If the human capital is so great, and the children are our future human capital, what is the reasoning for the argument that childcare is too expensive? Because if most of childcare is provided by women, and that human capital that they're developing is so valuable, what is the basis for saying it's too expensive?
Today or then?
I guess throughout history.
Yeah.
Because that's incredibly hard work that's being done, no matter who it's being done by. And if it's going to be paid for, it should be paid for well.
And I'll add one other thing to that, which is that our love of private families does not protect children. Things happen behind closed doors to women and children that, right, every single day. So to your point, if this human capital is so important, not only, I would add to your question, not only why do we always talk about how expensive it is, but also how precious, how we need to protect it from all kinds of things, right? And there have been movements throughout our history. The women's movement actually advocated for community childcare and to move children from being isolated only in private family as a form of childcare, but into community spaces. That went nowhere. I really think, I don't know the answer to your question because I struggle with it also. Why do we always talk about the cost of childcare as a nation? Why don't we have federal or state-sponsored childcare that would make it doable for people to make good wages, whether we're talking about the 40s or whether we're talking about today? And I do think the answer, honestly, and nobody likes this answer, is that it rocks a different apple cart for us. It changes our beliefs about who does what in a family. The minute you say that childcare can be outsourced, you have automatically changed the gender roles within that household. Now both people are breadwinners first, right? I'm great with that. You're probably great with that. But on a national scale, there are people across this country who are uncomfortable with this idea of childcare not being provided in the home by private families and overseen by the mother, right? And I often talk to my students about this. You can explain the gender wage gap in very simple terms. As long as childcare is seen as women's primary job, you will always have a gender wage gap. You can't do away with something that is influenced by the fact that women don't get job opportunities if people perceive them as mothers because there may be too much travel involved. And they want to take that job, right? So they don't even offer it to them. And they might get a higher salary if they did offer it to them. So I think we have, now because I'm on camera, I'm not using the words I really want to use right now. I'm going to use them. Oh, I don't care. I think we have this hard and fast attachment to our idea of who parents children. That makes it difficult for us to separate that and to then invest as a nation in federal, state-sponsored child care. I don't believe it's actually too expensive. I think lots of things that we put money into as a society are far more expensive than what child care would cost. And to your point, the investment in the future outweighs the cost. But I think the politics around debating for that in a country that really believes in private families and in women as mothers is what slows it down. That's a very long answer to a very short question, but I think it's the right answer.
Something you said in the middle, sort of, you were mentioning how things changed with rules and writing and literature from the 40s to the 60s to the 70s. And I think it all comes back to the fact that words are so important. I mean, even Rosie the Riveter's lyrics, they come around and around and around and around again. All we're having discussions about in the same way in the 40s or the 50s and now is the value of a woman. And we started to talk a little bit more about it in the 60s and 70s along with the civil rights and the Title IX. Mm-hmm. And then it sort of disappeared again, and then now it's coming back. I hope it's coming back.
Yeah, well, you know how that goes.
Mm-hmm. It's an up and down waves.
Yeah. You know, it's
but
interesting.
Language is so important.
It is, and it's interesting that you say that, Karen, because as I was preparing this talk and looking back at some of my research and even things I didn't use in my book, I found this really cool document that was put together by the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs in the late 1930s. And it's talking about all these issues around labor and child care and women, right, what women aren't getting in society. When we think about a document that did that for the first time, air quotes, we think about the President's Commission on the Status of Women in the 1960s, the American Woman document, which is seen as revolutionary as being the first time this was documented. But in fact, the document I just told you I found from the 1930s predates it by a lot. It very much does. And what that tells me in answer to your question and some of the other things we've been talking about is that these are not new questions. People talk about that American Woman document during JFK's years as revolutionary, and it is. And by the way, if you get a chance to see it, and you can see it online, the problems they raise are still the problems we have today. It's a really important revolutionary document, and it seems to spring from nowhere, right? It seems to be like JFK gets elected, and he likes, women helped him do that, so here comes the President's Commission on the Status of Women, just like Dewey did with Jane Todd. And so here comes the document, and then Betty Friedan, same year that the American Woman comes out, publishes the Feminine Mystique. But I'm going to tell you, as somebody with a longer view who studies the whole post-war era, that those documents didn't emerge from nothing. Those conversations, women had been having them all the way back to the broken promises of the post-war era. The post-war era promised women skills they could market and good-paying jobs after the war, and instead kicked them out of those jobs, right? And pushed them back into the feminized, lower-paid sectors. And about 20 to 30% of women kept decent-paying jobs, but not great ones. And I think when you see what happens by the 60s, you're seeing that pent-up frustration that had been building based on the broken promises of the post-war era.
We get the right to vote the same way. In
Yes.
the 1800s, we thought we were going to do it, and then these parades and all these different things, and it had to take a long time.
And keep your eye on it, because there are people who want to take that vote away from you.
I was thinking about the end of the war. Women were sent back home to make pancakes and make babies. And even as our society built up new industries, because we were no longer building bombers and stuff, they talk about the Westinghouse, how to make your home easier to deal with, and they always have this woman in this perfectly...
In the 50s, yeah.
Yeah, and even when the women started opening up their own business, they were all soft businesses. Tupperware, Avon, before bakeries, it took a long time before women could actually be managers, even supervisors, managers, executives. That is still something that isn't perfect and probably will never be perfect, but...
Yeah,
I guess that's not really a question. It was more like an observation.
No, but I appreciate that. You're right that a lot of what they were doing was in soft industries. They were making a killing at it, but not entirely soft industries. I'm trying to think now. As you were talking, a couple of them popped into my head, and now they've of course floated back out. But there were a few cases where women started things that were in not traditional fields. But they're fewer and far between, to your point. And even today, 97% of tech businesses, where all the real money in society is right now, are owned by men. Part of that has to do with capital, access to capital. So women get less than 5%, white women get less than 5% of venture capital money today, and black women get less than 1%. And yet black women open businesses faster than anybody else right now. There are 89% of new businesses being started today are being started by women of color. The joke I like to say about my book, and I really do hope you all read it, but I always say to people, you don't have to read my book. Here's what it's about. The job market wasn't built for women, so they started businesses of their own, right? And so when I tell people that black women are the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs, and that includes everybody, including white men, in some cases they're opening businesses at 4 times the rate of white men, the answer is discrimination. Which group gets discriminated the most, right? Discriminated against the most? It's women of color. And when you talk about the 60s and 70s and 80s, when women hit their head on that glass ceiling, they bounced out into entrepreneurship, many of them. Right? So some people say maybe it was a rubber ceiling. It was whatever it was, but that's what's happening. So women of color are bouncing out of the discrimination they're facing in the workplace when they hit that level that they cannot get beyond, into businesses of their own where they can achieve as much as they are able to through their own talents and skills.
One more comment about education. For girls went to home ed, boys went to shop. Right.
Right.
That was my high school experience.
Me too.
Sure. And as such, you're left with, again, back to, you're not going to open a plumbing store.
Yeah, you get a very gendered skill set.
And I really am excited when I see a woman who's running her own business, who she plays at the, oh, sorry.
There's a woman who opened her own plumbing business, and all of her tools are pink, and her truck is pink, and her overalls are pink. But, she's doing a good, now maybe she's playing up the I'm a woman. And
yeah, maybe. Or maybe she's doing a tongue-in-cheek thing. One of the most successful women in my book is a woman who went into the scrap metal business, and the men really wanted to get rid of her. And she says, she's still in business now. I talk to her every so often, and she says, they wanted to get rid of me, but they're all gone, and I'm still here.
Hello.
Hi.
Can we just loop back to the child care issue?
We can loop anywhere you want.
Is it easy for you to identify the root of our lust for the private family, where other wealthy countries have been able to set that aside and provide the child care that many of us feel is necessary?
Yeah.
What? Why?
As you're talking, I do know all of my U.S. history, but I'm thinking back about this. I mean, I think in many ways it goes back to the Protestant Christian roots of the country. And I'm hesitating because it's really hard to find one thing, right? But I do think it goes back to that. One of the fun stories I tell and it is a fun story, that I tell my students about the colonial era in our history is that Puritans understood human sexuality. They understood that people needed that from each other. What they didn't want was a society where you didn't know who belonged to who. So, we're getting to the fun part. So, they understood premarital sex. About 20% of Puritan women were pregnant before they got married. Yes. And what they didn't want was that baby to be born without knowing who was going to be financially responsible for that child. So, this is the fun part, and this is how I do it for my students. They believed that when you were in the throes of labor and delivery, and the pain was so intense, you were incapable of lying. Now, this is a world without DNA, without technology, so this is how I do it for my students. In that moment, when the woman's delivering that baby and they're trying to figure out who's going to be responsible for it, they say, "Who's the daddy?" That's how I do it for my students. But for you, I'll say, they ask her who is the father of this child, and whatever name she blurts out, that's who the women are going to circle that guy and ask him and pressure him to marry her. Because in that culture, in that moment, so I'm taking it all the way back for you. You wanted me to go back. In that moment, they're more concerned with the economics of this child not becoming a dependency on the society. They don't want to become the welfare state. They want the father to take responsibility for the family and the family to be a unit. I think it goes all the way back to that. And it comes out of that kind of culture of belonging, of knowing who belongs to who and who's responsible for who within that private family. And it gets worse in the mid-1800s when you have the beginnings of an ideology of domesticity, the Victorian era, where they really celebrate middle-class households and women's place in the household and the private family. It kind of gets locked in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s.
With all the immigration and other cultures and religions that we've accepted over the centuries, we still can't pop that zip. We just can't get over it.
I think that the more solidified that got in the Victorian era, in the era of domesticity, 1850s to 1900, and then you had that wave of immigration and settlement housework, the more children on the streets alone became associated with populations who were new immigrants in the ways that people demigrated immigration in that time period, right? The good homes knew where their children were. Right? Now, those poorer homes are not responsible for their children. It's that their children are helping with the economics of the family. Maybe they're picking rags to sell. Maybe they're actually, selling newspapers. They're doing whatever they have to do for the economics of the family. But from a sort of middle-class white Protestant point of view, those families look very, very different. So I think, not to get into an immigration conversation, but I think that there was that association with people who are different than us. Look at how we do things. It wasn't a positive one in the way you're talking about that I think you and I might share, this idea of different ideas influencing different people. I think sometimes when new things happen, old ideas get dug in. But, I'm with you. I don't, and with your friend here before you, I don't understand why as a nation we haven't thought through the value of a state-sponsored child care system. It also, by the way, smacked of communism and socialism in the early 20th century and mid-20th century Cold War. You had so many forces. Like, I could do a timeline for you. We had so many forces that worked against this idea. That's why even when they had them during World War II, people didn't want to leave their kids there. It smacked of socialism, which in the 20s and 30s was a real problem in this country. Socialized child care. Wait a minute. No, private, American. No. So, so you can, we could pinpoint lots of moments where you think, okay, this is, nope. Yeah.
So I guess it's a question, kind of a comment. So today we're in a reality with social media and everything that you have all of these tradwives. And you have a group of the population and those who hold the power that paint the 1950s as this romantic era where women weren't working and stayed home and took care of 25 kids that they had in 10 years. And then when you talk about the Westinghouse stuff, and I remember the commercials in the magazines that had the women in the modern conveniences in the kitchens and stuff like that, those were all 50s.
That's right.
Imagery too. So is it connected to the marketing that was so big in the 50s that we now look back and say the 50s was this amazing time where women stayed at home and didn't work? We totally disregard World War II and women's contribution, and now we're trying to enforce that as being the true history of women and families. And then you also, I thought it was really funny that you talk about private families. These influencers with their families are like the opposite of private families, but they're depicting these private lives that
in a public way.
Traditional, in a very public way.
But they're still celebrating private families while they share it with the whole world. But again, not creating new models. I mean, the 50s are so interesting. So the average age of first marriage for women in the 1950s is 19. This always freaks my students out, because I say, you all would have a couple of kids right now. But to your point, this is actually a very important era for women's entrepreneurship because they're getting these messages to stay home. They're getting the kitchen debates with Nixon and Khrushchev. We have better appliances. Our women are better cared for. Your women have to work. And you're getting all of this sort of message of containment. The women who are starting businesses are doing it under the guise of being good mothers. So Lillian Vernon, you all remember the Lillian Vernon catalog? She made $238 million by 1999 with that catalog, which she started from her kitchen table in 1951. But how does she package it? My husband was never going to be able to afford to give us the things I wanted my children to have, so I started a business. You have Mrs. Totino's Pizza, Totino's Pizza rolls that are all over the place. That's Rose Totino in the 50s starting that business. She's actually the first person to make a successful and good tasting frozen pizza. And she gets her bank loan by making pizza for the bankers, because Americans don't know what pizza is yet. So she has to bring a little oven to the bank, and she has to, right? Women had to do all this extra stuff, but they're doing it in the 50s. They're still starting businesses, but they're doing it that way. And there was a woman whose daughter I interviewed for my book who talked about the fact that there was a lot of domestic violence in the home. But when her mother started a business, there was less, because there was less money tension. As long as she was home by 6 o'clock and dinner was on the table. True. Yeah.
Just really quickly, I want to build off Joanna's, because she was going into it, what I wanted to hit, which was in the 50s, where it does seem a lot that it's marketing and pop culture is reinforcing these gender roles that were previously made wavy during World War II. Do you find in your classroom, a lot of hay has been made about a lot of the younger generation of boys in particular have gone a little bit more fascist? Do you find that there is, you're dealing with students who are kind of looking at that, the World War II sort of gender waviness that's going on, and then the 50s sort of imposition by pop culture? Do you see that like whiplash sort of take place in the eyes of your students?
I think they're afraid to admit any of that to me. I don't know if that's happening, to be honest. I know it is happening in the bigger world, right? Among my students, I see a little of it. I see it in subtle ways because, it's pretty clear what I'm writing about and what I'm researching. So students will always kind of tiptoe around if they want to, how much they want to reveal about what their own thoughts are. But a couple of things about the 50s and a couple of things about that. I think that for a young generation to think that the 1950s was this sort of perfect magical time where everything was easy and, you only needed one income, puts an awful lot of pressure just taking it at that surface level for a minute, on, if you buy into the full image of it, which was, by the way, never true. It was never true in the 50s. It's not true now.
Misunderstanding of
Yeah.
Rockwell and maybe a proper understanding of Thomas Piketty.
If Good Housekeeping is writing articles about why you should leave your job to take care of your kids, women have jobs, right? If Good Housekeeping is writing articles about how to do dinner even quicker, it's because women need a fast recipe, right? Because they're working. Like, you have to read between the lines of everything you see in 50s magazines. I love to do this anyway. I spent some of my pre-academic life as a journalist, and I'm going to put journalist in air quotes when I talk about the writing I did for women's magazines, because it was a lot of that. It was a lot of service writing about how to make your life easier and better. But you always know what's going on in a country based on the recipes women are getting, right? Is food prices too high or too low, right? Are they fast or are they going to take all day? In the 50s, they're doing both. They're telling women to make recipes that take all day, subtext, so you can't have a job, or they're telling women, here's a really quick dinner, subtext, because we know you're working, right? So it's never what people think it is, in terms of just talking about gender here for a second. The other piece of it that it never really was easy for the men, right? The one, when we were at a different political moment and I would teach, I would say, the women's movement didn't just liberate women. It liberated men from bearing all of the financial burdens of a family. It understood that men have emotions too, men have feelings too, men have pressures too, and it liberated men to share those and to cry and to whatever they needed to do, but also to share responsibility financially. And it gave women opportunities to explore talents and skills and education that they wanted to explore. So now we're in this other weird moment where, we want to go back to this trad thing of the 50s that never really existed. And because women's labor market participation never went down after 1948. It went down for about 2 years after the war as people, sorted things out. And then it's continuously up until this year. This year, recently, in the last several months, 450,000 women left the workforce. To your point about this shift. But most of it has to do with childcare. Because during the pandemic, they could be home with their kids, and now companies are saying, nope, no more remote work. So it's not that women want to leave the workforce, it's that childcare is too expensive. And the other problem with waxing nostalgic about the 1950s is it forgets how horrific it was to be a person of color in the 1950s. With, legal segregation in large swaths of this country and covert segregation everywhere else, right? So, I think, I'm going to predict something. I don't like to predict, but I'm going to predict something. I think that for this young generation right now that thinks that the 50s would be great to go back to, they're going to figure out pretty quickly, not only that it didn't exist, but that it was actually hard for everybody. It was hard to be gay in the 50s because you were illegal, right? All the things that this generation takes for granted, they're going to realize were hard fought for and hard won, and you really don't want to give those back, those rights. And I think for a minute, while you're 19, 20, and not in the workforce, not dealing with a family, not trying to pay a mortgage, you might say, yeah, I want to go back to having a submissive wife or being the sole breadwinner. But when you actually have to do it, I have a feeling many of them are going to run screaming back to a world of sharing.
I had something else to add to the generational question. During World War II, my grandfather, he had German ancestry, and he worked on a farm in Minnesota. So this is information passed down through the generations, but World War II prisoners of war were settled in Minnesota as farm workers, and so he, knowing German, would go and direct farm workers during the day, and my grandmother would take my oldest aunt with her, and they would serve sandwiches and whatnot to support the the prisoners of war. And I have to say that the story is the prisoners of war were so happy to be in Minnesota as opposed to Germany. But who was left behind to take care of the other children was my great-grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
So my great-grandmother was always there to support my mother, basically. And on the other side of the family worked in factories in Norwich. And when my dad and his brother were very young, who was left behind but my great-grandmother to take care of him? So during that generation, the great-grandparents, or grandparents basically, were there to take care of the children. Then as the country became more mobile, that decreased. And
Yep.
so we have what used to be a live-in childcare system is no longer there. And I think that's great because it's liberation for the older parent. You know,
That's also, you also had that because before Social Security, the elder folks had no other option but to live with relatives.
Right. So as we change that within our nation, the child care help, not that it would have to be 100% of the time or 30 hours a week, but even for those temporary female workers, it would be a great help to have that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. You and I have to start a business, I think.
8 o'clock, we'll close it out. I think Karen was the last one to ask a question.
She sort of answered it.
Oh, okay. Anybody else then? Okay. One more round of applause for Dr. Michael, please.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate you.